It is the one and only novel ever published by its author. Since its release, it has sold close to 70 million copies worldwide, and continues to sell around 1 million copies each year. Among its ever-growing success have come some controversies, though these could be argued to have only highlighted the book's status even further. With a well-documented history of being banned, it was the most challenged book in the United States from 1961 to 82, making the top 10 list again with a resurgence in 2005 to 2009. It has also been widely documented as a favoured read of several high-profile killers. Written by J.D. Salinger, this is the tale of Holden Caulfield. This is The Catcher in the Rye. On July 16, 1951, Little, Brown & Company published the novel The Catcher in the Rye. Salinger had written stories previously that featured the Caulfield family, with Holden Caulfield himself appearing in some of them, though it would be in The Catcher in the Rye where he would be truly fleshed out. The novel, unlike those other stories, had difficulties being published. Originally solicited to Harcourt Brace & Company, the book was rejected after the trade division asked whether Holden was supposed to be crazy. After finally being bought by Little, Brown & Company, it was also rejected by the New Yorker after Salinger approached them thinking they would want to print excerpts from the novel, having already published several of his short stories. It stated that they found the Caulfield children too precocious to be plausible, and Salinger's writing style exhibitionistic. Following its eventual release, the book was not an instant success. It never reached the top of the bestseller list, being in the mix for 30 weeks but never climbing higher than 4th. Initial reception was mixed. Some hailed the character of Holden Caulfield and his style of narration, while others felt that the novel was amateur and unnecessarily coarse. The New York Times posted a review stating that Holden's story is told in Holden's own strange, wonderful language by J.D. Salinger in an unusually brilliant novel. Holden is bewildered, lonely, ludicrous, and pitiful. His troubles, his failings, are not of his own making, but of a world that is out of joint. There is nothing wrong with him that a little understanding and affection, preferably from his parents, couldn't have set right. Though confused and unsure of himself, like most 16-year-olds, he is observant and perceptive and filled with a certain wisdom. His minor delinquencies seem minor indeed when contrasted with adult delinquencies with which he is confronted. Mr. Salinger, whose work has appeared in the New Yorker and elsewhere, tells a story well, in this case under the special difficulties of casting it in the form of Holden's first-person narrative. This was a perilous undertaking, but one that has been successfully achieved. In contrast, a more critical view from the New Republic claimed, "The book as a whole is disappointing, and not merely because it is a reworking of a theme that one begins to suspect must obsess the author. Holden Caulfield, the main character who tells his own story, is an extraordinary portrait, but there is too much of him. In the course of 277 pages, the reader wearies of his explicitness, repetition, and adolescence, exactly as one would weary of Holden himself. And this reader at least suffered from an irritating feeling that Holden was not quite so sensitive and perceptive as he, and his creator, thought he was. In any case, he is so completely self-centered that the other characters who wander through the book, with the notable exception of his sister Phoebe, had nothing like his authenticity. In a writer of Salinger's undeniable talent, one expects something more." A glowing report from the Associated Press read, "He tells the story himself, tough and tender, frown and smile, bitter and sweet. It's a sort of lost weekend, it's a boy who can't go home again. He belongs to a lost generation and lives in a world he never made. It reminds us of significant conclusions reached by other writers in our time. Novels don't come much better." It is perhaps this last review that touches upon aspects of the book that I think are truly still resonating today. These ideas of a person who can't go home. drifting, aimless, part of a lost generation. There is alienation and angst, comedy and embarrassment, sexual frustration, a frown and a smile. Those of us who have gone through our teenage years will know some of these feelings quite well. We've all been there, and that's part of what makes The Catcher in the Rye and Holden Caulfield so universal. Having read the book twice in the past, I originally found Holden frustrating, almost annoying, though that didn't stop him sticking around in my mind for weeks after. Then, instead of frustration, during my second read-through, I found understanding, embarrassment of my younger self, though also realisation and comfort in the fact that I wasn't the only one. I also felt empathy for Holden, his words and outlook almost tragic, results of a not-so-great hand dealt by life. I decided it was only right to read the book a third time for the purposes of this film, to refamiliarise myself with some parts that I've no doubt forgotten, to get absorbed into Holden's world once more, retrace his steps, and hear what he has to say with fresh ears. Right from the start, from the very first sentence in fact, we get a real sense of Holden's character, his mood, and feel as if we almost get off on the wrong foot with him, that we are perhaps an inconvenience to him, as he tells us what he can be bothered to divulge. You can almost feel the deepest of sighs. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born, and what my lousy childhood was like, and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me, and all that David Copperfield kind of crap, but I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. This sets the tone for what is to come. We find Holden atop a hill at the school he is, or was, attending, Pensy Prep, overlooking the last football game of the year. You see, he's being kicked out for not applying himself, but before he leaves, his presence is requested by his old history teacher, Mr. Spencer, who is concerned about him. With history being one of the subjects that Holden is failing, we are treated to the extent of the exam paper he submitted for the subject, which consists of 2 paragraphs about the Egyptians, with a further footnote reading, "Dear Mr. Spencer, that is all I know about the Egyptians. I can't seem to get very interested in them, although your lectures are very interesting. It is alright with me if you flunk me though, as I am flunking everything else except English anyway. Respectfully yours, Holden Caulfield." "Do you have absolutely no concern for your future, boy?" Spencer asks, to which Holden replies, "Oh, I feel some concern for my future alright. Sure I do. But not too much, I guess. Not too much, I guess." I noticed that this became a theme for Holden as I read through this chapter, and the book in general. His apathy, his exhaustion of people, of responsibility, and his preference for avoidance entirely is accomplished by Salinger's use of one single word, but. Holden has concerns for his future, but not too much. He acknowledges that the old man Spencer is genuinely trying to help him, but he feels they are just too much on opposite sides of the pole, that's all. He even feels sympathy for the old man, but he just can't hang around there any longer, them being on opposite sides of the pole, watching Spencer miss the bed whenever he throws something at it, wearing his sad old bathrobe with his chest showing and the smell of Vicks nose drops all over the place. And when asked if he would like a hot chocolate before heading back out into the cold, Holden answers, "I would, I really would, but the thing is, I have to get going. I have to go right to the gym. Thanks though, thanks a lot, sir." This last statement turns out not to be true, confirmed by Holden at the start of chapter 3 of the novel. "I'm the most terrific liar you ever saw in your life. It's awful. If I'm on the way to the store to buy a magazine even, and somebody asks me where I'm going, I'm liable to say I'm going to the opera. It's terrible. So when I told old Spencer I had to go to the gym and get my equipment and stuff, that was a sheer lie. I don't even keep my goddamn equipment in the gym." There is always a reason not to with Holden, a reluctance, a reason to be elsewhere, anywhere else. This need or reaction of his to avoid situations or responsibilities such as school and his reluctance to engage are described well in a character analysis on cliffsnotes.com. Holden resents the adult world and resists entry into it, but he has little choice. Society and his own body are telling him that it's time for him to change. He's attracted to the trappings of adulthood, booze, cigarettes, the idea of sex, and a kind of independence, but he despises the compromises, loss of innocence, absence of integrity, and loss of authenticity in the grown-up world. Holden, after all, wants to be the catcher in the rye, someone who saves children from falling from a cliff, which can be understood as a metaphor for entering adulthood. The website, abookgeek.com, posted an article in 2014 highlighting the importance of the novel and what we can take away from it through Holden's experiences. Mentioned is his younger brother, Ali, who died age 11 of leukemia, and how that event helped to strip Holden's dreams from him. And yet, despite his consistently bleak outlook, how he still holds out some hope for others. We can pretend those scars don't exist, and I hope we all move on with our lives, eventually. He lost his brother. In some sense, he also lost his childhood. His life will never be the same, and he's acting out. Already his dreams for the future have been destroyed. Yes, we could point to depression and hormonal imbalance. We could even say that the alcohol, survivor's guilt, and other angst-ridden activities have driven him to dismiss any thought of dreaming. But he still holds out some hope for the innocence of other kids, that they won't be ruined, destroyed as the train wreck of adulthood spirals them forward. As Holden leaves Pensy Prep a few days early before the Christmas break, he heads to New York, unable to go home as his parents are unaware of him being kicked out. His situation is a perfect metaphor for his life in general. Just like being pulled between the perks of adulthood and the responsibilities that they come burdened with, he is neither here nor there, treading water, frozen, stuck in a cold December New York. He checks into a hotel, and when inside his room, he describes it as a very crummy room, with nothing to look out of the window at except for the other side of the hotel. I didn't care much. I was too depressed to care whether I had a good view or not. The bellboy that showed me to the room was this very old guy around 65. He was even more depressing than the room was. He was one of those bald guys that comb all of their hair over from the side to cover up the baldness. I'd rather be bald than do that. Anyway, what a gorgeous job for a guy around 65 years old, carrying people's suitcases and waiting around for a tip. I suppose he wasn't too intelligent or anything, but it was terrible anyway. Not only does the sight of the old man seem depressing to Holden, I think there's also an element of fear, not of the man himself, but of what is to come. It's another reminder of the ever-ticking clock, that youth isn't forever, that things don't get easier. It's everything that Holden is trying so hard to keep at arm's length. Later, while staring from the window of his room, he catches sight of people in rooms on the opposite side of the hotel who haven't bothered to roll down their blinds. One, a grey-haired man, is dressed in women's clothing and admiring himself in the mirror, while just above his room, a couple are having drinks and spitting them on each other's faces, both in hysterics. Holden admits that while these activities are junk, he can't help but find them fascinating. In his mind, he feels he is the world's biggest sex maniac who can think of very crummy things, some of which he wouldn't mind doing and might be fun, if both parties were enjoying it. The thing is though, he says, I don't like the idea. It stinks, if you analyse it. I think if you don't really like a girl, you shouldn't horse around with her at all, and if you do like her, then you're supposed to like her face, and if you like her face, you ought to be careful about doing crummy stuff to it. That's the thing about Holden. He may call people phonies, and dislike numerous things that they do, and sometimes have a private joke with himself about them, but there is no malice, no actual ill will towards them. So I was surprised, before I visited the book again, to find the word violent among the list of complaints made against it over the years. I never considered the book to be an overly violent one, with Holden even claiming himself to be a pacifist. Sure, there were a couple of physically violent moments in the book, one when Holden explodes after his roommate returns from a date with a girl Holden cares for, someone he knows is vulnerable with, as he suspects, a very unfortunate past. He pushes his roommate too far and gets punched, ending up on the floor, covered in blood. Another violent incident occurs when Holden is at the hotel in New York. He meets a man named Morris in the elevator, who asks Holden if he wants company for the night, stating $5 for a throw. Holden accepts the offer, though instantly regrets it afterwards and wishes that he hadn't. Later, a woman named Sunny shows up at his door, though the two never have sex, with Holden lying and claiming he's recovering from back surgery. He still pays her the $5 though, but she returns later with Morris, who states, despite their prior arrangement, that the price was $10. Holden refuses to pay the extra $5 and calls Morris a moron. Morris punches Holden in the stomach and Sunny takes the extra $5 from his wallet before they leave. A further example of violence can be found in the character of James Castle, who knew Holden and was even wearing one of his sweaters on the day when he, whilst being bullied by other students, jumped from a window at the school they were both attending. His death is another thing that weighs heavy on Holden as he struggles through life. I struggled to find other violence shown by Holden, at least physically. He ponders in the book how he actively avoids it, especially fistfights, like when his gloves were stolen, and he imagines confronting the thief, knowing that it would only end with words, with him making sure not to be directly accusing of them. To say that Holden is violent, I find to be a stretch. Impulsive and eccentric perhaps, but not violent. There are of course Holden's thoughts, where the themes of the book live, some of which sometimes stray into darker places, though we will look into those later on in the video. After his first night in New York, an already frayed and delicate Holden really starts to unravel and come apart, as summarised on Wikipedia's plot summary. The next morning, Holden, increasingly depressed and desperate for personal connection, calls Sally Hayes, despite his characterisation of her as Queen of all phonies. They agree to meet that afternoon to attend a play at the Biltmore Theatre. Meanwhile, Holden shops for a special record, Little Shirley Beans, for his 10-year-old sister, Phoebe. After the play, Holden and Sally ice skate at Rockefeller Center, where Holden rants against society and frightens Sally. He invites her to run away with him that night, to live in the New England wilderness, but she declines. The conversation sours, and the two part angrily. He then meets his old classmate, Carl Luce, for drinks at the Wicker Bar. There, Holden annoys Carl, whom he suspects of being gay, by unrelentingly questioning him about his sex life. Luce says Holden should see a psychiatrist to understand himself better. Afterwards, Holden gets drunk, awkwardly flirts with several adults, accidentally breaks Phoebe's record, and finds himself broke. It's just one bad beat after another. His already skewed view of the world, caused by his depression, his expulsion from Pensy Prep, his drunkenness, and his frustrations with sex and life in general, are made further worse by a pile of negative experiences that keep growing. Attempts to connect with others ultimately ends up in parting ways, often a result of his own doing, which can be a hard pill to swallow. It can make one even more withdrawn, and more bitter. It's a vicious cycle. Nostalgic to see his sister Phoebe, Holden sneaks into his parents' apartment while they're out. Though she is happy to see him, Phoebe quickly guesses that he's been expelled and chastises him for his general aimlessness and disdain. When she asks if he cares about anything, Holden shares his fantasy of being the catcher in the rye, based on his mishearing of Robert Burns's Coming Through the Rye. Phoebe points out that the actual poem says, "When a body meet a body coming through the rye." Holden breaks down in tears, and his sister tries to console him. As his parents return home, he slips out and visits his former English teacher, Mr. Antolini, who expresses concern that Holden is headed for a terrible fall. Antolini advises him to begin applying himself and provides him with a place to sleep. Holden is upset when he awakens to find Mr. Antolini patting his head, which he interprets as an advance. He leaves and spends the rest of the night in a train waiting room at Grand Central Terminal, sinking deeper into despair. In the morning, having lost hope of ever finding meaningful connection in the city, he decides to head out west to live as a gas station attendant in a log cabin. He arranges to see Phoebe at lunchtime to explain his plan and say goodbye. When they meet up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she arrives with a suitcase and asks if she can go with him. Holden refuses, which upsets Phoebe. He tries to cheer her up by allowing her to skip school at the Central Park Zoo, but she remains angry. The two of them eventually reach the carousel, where they reconcile after he buys her a ticket. The sight of her riding that carousel fills him with happiness. He then speaks of encountering his parents that night and getting sick, mentioning that he will, in fact, be attending another academy in September. The novel ends with Holden stating that he's reluctant to say more because talk of school has made him miss his former classmates. There is an assumption by some that Holden is telling his story from a mental hospital. While this is never fully confirmed, there are instances in the book where it's hinted at. From the website enotes.com, in the final chapter of The Catcher in the Rye, Holden states that after he returned home, he got sick. Then he mentions the school to which he will be sent in the fall if he gets out of here. In the following paragraph, Holden refers to a psychoanalyst they have here, who annoys him with his questions. He then says DB, his older brother, drove over to see him last Saturday. Whether it's called a mental hospital or not, it's certainly a residential institution in which psychoanalysis takes place. Holden's return to school is constantly mentioned, and the main question that seems to interest the psychoanalyst is whether he intends to apply himself to his studies. This suggests that Holden's mental breakdown, if one has actually occurred, is not regarded as very serious. He may be undergoing something more like a rest cure than a regular course of psychiatric treatment. This is supported by something that Holden says at the beginning of the book. I got pretty run down and had to come out here and take it easy. While at the beginning the reader might think he's talking about a vacation, by the end we understand he is talking about something else. Holden, of course, is an unreliable narrator, but his evidence is all the reader has. An article named Holden Caulfield, Egotistical Whiner or Melancholy Boy Genius was posted on LitHub in 2018. Is Holden Caulfield the tragic hero or an unbearable whiny teen? Is he misunderstood? Is he relevant to youth today? Is The Catcher in the Rye even any good? Does it matter if it has meant something to generations of readers? Do we only like it because our parents did? If nothing else, we can all at least agree that Holden Caulfield is still, though decreasingly, a cultural touchstone. In part because parents keep giving the book to their children, and in part because so many students are still required to read it in school. Accordingly, over the years, there have been hundreds and maybe thousands of critical essays written about Salinger's work in general, and The Catcher in Rye in particular, and Holden Caulfield in even more particular. The critics, much like the population at large, do not come to much of a consensus. So, what of the man who created Holden Caulfield? What of his story, his history? Biography.com describes J.D. Salinger as, despite his slim body of work and reclusive lifestyle, a literary giant, with Catcher in the Rye being a landmark novel that set a new course of literature in post-World War II America. His short stories, appearing in The New Yorker, are stated to have inspired the early careers of writers such as Philip Roth, John Updike, and Harold Brodkey. Born on January 1st, 1919, in New York, Jerome David Salinger was the youngest of two children. His father, Salt, was the son of a rabbi who ran a cheese and ham import business. His mother, Miriam, was Scottish-born. During a time when mixed marriages of their kind were frowned upon, her non-Jewish background only became apparent to Salinger after his bar mitzvah at the age of 14. Despite Salinger's apparent intellect, just like Holden Caulfield, he wasn't the greatest student. He flunked out of McBurney School, situated near his home, and was sent by his parents to Valley Forge Military Academy in Wayne, Pennsylvania. After graduating, he spent 1 year at New York University before travelling to Europe, where he spent most of his time in Vienna. Once he returned home, he attempted college again, this time in Pennsylvania, before heading back to New York, where he took night classes at Columbia University. It was there that things finally began to take shape for Salinger. It was there that he met Professor Whit Burnett. Burnett wasn't just a good teacher, he was also the editor of Story magazine, an influential publication that showcased short stories. And soon Salinger's work was appearing not just in Story, but in other big-name publications such as Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post. Just as his writing career was starting to take off, World War II, and in particular the attack on Pearl Harbor, brought yet another twist to Salinger's life. Like countless others, he was drafted into the army and served from 1942 to 44. He landed on Utah Beach during the Normandy invasion and was present at the Battle of the Bulge. Still, despite everything, he continued to write. Shane Salerno, co-author of the book Salinger and director of a related documentary, was interviewed by NPR in 2013 and stated of Salinger's war experience, "One of the first details I learned was that he was carrying 6 chapters of The Catcher in the Rye when he landed on D-Day. That was something that stunned me. He carried those chapters with him almost as a talisman to keep him alive, and he worked on the book throughout the war." Before he landed on D-Day, Salinger was a Park Avenue rich kid. Nothing prepared him for what World War II was going to do to him psychologically. We know this because at the end of the war, he checked into a mental institution, and then did something truly remarkable, which is, came out of the mental institution, and signed back up for more, and participated in a denazification of Germany. Details regarding his stay at the hospital are unclear, though it's almost certain that he met a German woman there, named Sylvia, and that the two ended up marrying, though their union would last for less than a year. An article on pbs.org tells how Salinger, who could speak both French and German, was involved in interviewing prisoners and civilians, and how he formed a strong friendship with 3 other men in the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, one of whom took the only known photo of him writing The Catcher in the Rye during his service. After the war, he returned to New York in 1946 and pressed on with his writing. He sought out the help of his old writing teacher, Whit Burnett, in publishing a collection of 20 short stories. The collection was called The Young Folks, featuring 10 works that were previously published, and 10 that weren't. Burnett was optimistic about the book's publication, and even negotiated Salinger a $1,000 advance, though, eventually, the book would be rejected. Salinger placed blame on Burnett, and the two became estranged. Salinger would go on to find his works published in the New Yorker, all the while still continuing to work away on his novel. After a year of reworks, A Perfect Day for a Banana Fish was published in the magazine's January 1948 issue. Salinger continued to publish more short stories, with several focusing and building upon the Glasses, a fictional family first featured in his Banana Fish story. Then, in 1951, the novel that had travelled so far with him, both physically and emotionally, finally emerged. The Catcher in the Rye was published. As stated earlier, the book received mixed reviews, but one thing that was undeniable, over time, as it was consumed by the reading public, the book would massively catapult Salinger's level of literary fame. Biography.com states that, for the young writer, who had fiercely boasted in college about his talents, the success he had seemingly craved early in life became the thing he would eventually come to run away from. In 1953, 2 years after the publication of Catcher, Salinger pulled up stakes in New York and retreated to a secluded 90-acre place in Cornish, New Hampshire. There, he did his best to cut off contact with the public, as significantly slowed his literary output. 2 collections of his work were published in book form in the early 1960s. In the June 1965 edition of the New Yorker, nearly the entire issue was dedicated to a new short story, the 25,000-word Hapworth 16, 1924. To the dismay of many anxious readers, Hapworth was the last Salinger piece ever to be published while he was still alive. In 1955, Salinger married Claire Douglas, daughter of British art critic Robert Langdon Douglas. They were together for just over a decade and had 2 children. In 1966, Claire Douglas filed for divorce, reporting that if the relationship continued, it would seriously injure her health and endanger her reason. This was not to be Salinger's last relationship. 6 years after his divorce, he began a relationship with Joyce Maynard, a college freshman. Her story, An 18-Year-Old Looks Back on Life, had appeared in the New York Times Magazine. She and Salinger would live together in Cornish for 10 months before he eventually kicked her out. Maynard would go on to release a memoir in 1998 that, as biography.com states, painted a controlling and obsessive portrait of her former lover. A year later, she auctioned off letters that Salinger had written to her during their relationship. They sold for over $150,000. Salinger would go on to date the actress Elaine Joyce for some time, before going on to marry a nurse, Colleen O'Neill, and the two would remain married until Salinger's death on January 27, 2010. He died of natural causes, aged 91. Biography.com also states that those who knew Salinger claimed that he wrote every day, with one guess being that there were up to 10 finished novels locked away in his house. In 2013, new light was supposedly shed on Salinger's life and work. The biography book, Salinger, was published, with one of its revelations being that there were about 5 unpublished works by Salinger scheduled for release over the next few years, with one being based on Salinger's brief marriage to Sylvia, and another surrounding Holden Caulfield himself, and these 2 stories will be published by 2020. This, of course, did not come to fruition. Salinger's son, Matt Salinger, refuted the claims outright, stating they had little to no bearing on reality, though he himself had begun, along with Salinger's widow, Colleen O'Neill, to actually prepare some of his father's material for publication. The process was stated to have begun in 2011. So far, no new material has been released. It is quite clear, and understandably so, that J.D. Salinger and Holden Caulfield are closely intertwined. Whether going from school to school, receiving psychiatric help, or living a life mostly estranged from others, the similarities are obvious. Salinger poured himself into the character of Holden, and the novel as a whole. This could be said, of course, of any writer, though there is a reason that Holden Caulfield has stood the test of time, and why the book, despite its numerous bans, was and is taught and read so widely. So why was the book banned in the first place? And why is it still today considered by some to be a red flag? The Banned Books Project website states that The Catcher in the Rye is frequently incorporated into classroom curriculums because of its relevance to high school students, but has had its place in the classroom repeatedly challenged. The first recorded challenge took place in 1960 when an Oklahoma teacher was fired for teaching the book to her 11th grade students. Though she successfully appealed her dismissal, the book was still removed from the school. Since then, dozens of challenges have taken place for various reasons. Between 1986 and 2000, at least 9 different attempts to remove The Catcher in the Rye from schools were based on the novel's use of profanity and sexual references. 3 of these attempts, Wyoming in 1986, North Dakota in 1987, and 1989 in California, were successful in getting the book removed. After looking a little further, I found a list of individual instances where the novel was challenged and in some cases banned, with the latest one being in 2010 after a parent complained about its coarse language. The challenge was unsuccessful and the book was retained. The majority of instances listed cite the same complaints, each using words such as obscene, vulgar, violent, unacceptable, blasphemous, negative, a filthy, filthy book. But it has been my experience that banning something, be it a film or one of the countless songs to have been silenced over the years, or in this case a novel, has only ever served to bolster interest and desire for those things. Despite the actual reason for the book's numerous bans from schools, I think it's the fact that the book was banned is more what draws people's interests. It's the headline rather than the small print. There's little doubt that this plays a role in the book's muddy reputation, though it would be another event, one that would shake the world in 1980, that would link Salinger's book to something much, much darker.
Good evening. The death of a man who sang and played the guitar overshadows the news from Poland around in Washington tonight. Former Beatle John Lennon, who was 40, was shot and killed last night outside his luxury apartment in New York.
We have arrested Mark David Chapman of 55 South Kukui, Kukui Street, Hawaii, for the homicide of John Lennon.
Chapman checked into this YMCA last Saturday, moved into a Midtown hotel the next day, was seen outside the Dakota over the weekend and yesterday. According to police, he managed to get Lennon to autograph a record album. During arraignment, Chapman was charged today with second-degree murder. He showed no reaction or emotion. The assistant district attorney said Chapman committed a deliberate, premeditated execution of John Lennon in a cool, calm, calculated manner.
John Lennon and his wife arrived back at the Dakota in a limousine. They parked the limousine on the curb right outside the Dakota. They got out of the car, out of the limousine, and walked into the archway area of the Dakota. To the right, as you walk in the archway area, is kind of a vestibule, which has a doorway, a glass doorway. This individual, Mr. Chapman, came up behind him and called to him, Mr. Lennon, as he arrived at that doorway. And then, in a combat stance, he emptied the Charter Arms .38 caliber gun that he had with him and shot John Lennon.
Mark David Chapman, the man who shot John Lennon, was not only obsessed with the former Beatles frontman, he was also obsessed with The Catcher in the Rye and with Holden Caulfield. Speaking in 1992, in an interview on CNN, Chapman told of the events before, during and after the tragic event. He describes how he met John Lennon, obtained an autograph from him, and how he would eventually see his plan of murder to fruition. During the interview, which lasts around 9 minutes, Chapman almost seems to make sure that The Catcher in the Rye is bound to his story. Even though not questioned about it, he still mentions the book several times, including how he bought a copy and signed it, "To Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield. This is my statement," on the morning of that tragic day.
Welcome back to Larry King Live with Mark David Chapman. Mark, will you relive with us those terrible moments for you, for the world, for a lot of people around and in circles close to John Lennon? What happened that night?
Well, if you want to pick it up from the night, I was standing there with a gun in my pocket.
Knew you were going to shoot him?
Sorry?
Knew you were going to shoot him?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Tried not to, praying not to, but knowing down deep it was probably going to come to that.
Did you know it would be that night? Did you know you would see him again?
Yes, I knew that morning, oddly, when I left the hotel, I had some type of premonition that this was the last time I was going to leave my hotel room. I hadn't seen him up to that point. That's what makes it interesting. I wasn't even sure he was in the building. And then I left the hotel room, bought a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, signed it to Holden Caulfield from Holden Caulfield, and wrote underneath that, "This is my statement," underlining the word "this," the emphasis on the word "this." I had planned not to say anything after the shooting. Walked briskly up Central Park West to 72nd Street and began milling around there with the fans that were there, Jude and Jerry, and later a photographer that came there.
Okay. And then John came out that day, right?
He came out. I was leaning against the gargoyle studded railing and was looking down. I was reading The Catcher in the Rye, and I believe he got into a taxi and disappeared. And then later that day, I had gone to lunch with, I believe, Jude. We came back.
With who?
With Jude. She was a fan there that was there at the building. And we struck up a conversation about Hawaii, about John Lennon. She'd been there a number of times. And at one point during the day, she had left, and John came back out. I don't remember him going back in from the taxi, but he was obviously back in the building. He was doing an RKO radio special. And he came out of the building, and the photographer that I mentioned earlier, Paul Gorish, he kind of pushed me forward and said, "Here's your chance. You know, you've been waiting all day. You've come from Hawaii to have him sign your album. Go, go." And I was very nervous. And I was right in front of John Lennon there instantly, and I had a black Bic pen, and I said, "John, would you sign my album?" And he said, "Sure." Yoko went and got into the car, and he pushed the button on the pen and started to get it to write. It was a little hard to get to write at first. And then he wrote his name, John Lennon, and then underneath that, 1980. And he looked at me, as I mentioned earlier, he said, "Is that all? Do you want anything else?" And I felt then and now that he knew something subconsciously, that he was looking into the eyes of the person that was going to kill him.
Why do you think that?
Well, his wife was in the car, the door was open, and he's a busy man. He's going to go to a radio or to his record studio, and he's talking to a nobody, just sign an album for a nobody. And he's asking me, is that all I want? I mean, he's given me the autograph. I don't have a camera on me. What could I give him?
I would admit that is a strange thing to say. All right, so he leaves.
Yes,
right?
he leaves in the
what
car.
do you do the rest of the day?
I stand around like an idiot waiting for him to come back.
And what time did he come back?
He came back about 10 to 11 at night.
Had you eaten dinner?
No, I had not.
Fear you might have missed him?
Probably.
Knew you were going to shoot him?
Yes.
How did that happen? What happened?
Well, the photographer left. In all fairness, I have to say, I tried to get him to stay.
Because?
There were those that felt that I wanted him to shoot pictures of the shooting, which is not true.
Why then did you want him to stay?
I wanted him to stay because I wanted out of there. There was a great part of me that didn't want to be there. I asked Jude, the fan, before she left, for a date that night. She said no. If she'd have said yes, I would have been on the date with her.
But you might have killed him the next day.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
I would
okay.
have probably come back.
The circumstances of the killing, what happened?
I was sitting at the inside of the arch of the Dakota building, and It was dark. It was windy. Jose, the doorman, was out along the sidewalk. And here's another odd thing that happened. I was at an angle where I could see Central Park West and 72nd, and I see this limousine pull up. And as you know, there's probably hundreds of limousines that turn up Central Park West in the evening. But I knew that was his. And I said, this is it. And I stood up. The limousine pulled up. The door opened. The rear left door opened. Yoko got out. John was far behind, say 20 feet, when he got out. I nodded to Yoko when she walked by me.
She nod back?
No, she didn't. And I don't mean to be so clinical about this, but I've told it a number of times. I hope you understand. John came out, and he looked at me, and I think he recognized, here's the fella that I signed the album earlier. And he walked past me. I took 5 steps toward the street, turned, withdrew my Charter Arms 38, and fired 5 shots into his back.
What, had you shot that weapon before?
That weapon, no. I didn't even know if the bullets were going to work. And when they worked, I remember thinking, they're working, they're working. I was worried that the plane in the baggage compartment, the humidity had ruined them. And I remember thinking, they're working.
What did Yoko do?
She, naturally, and I can't blame her, she dashed around the stair area. I don't know if it's still there at the Dakota today, but she just, you know, ran for cover, which is what anyone would do. Mm-hmm. John, according to what I've been told, stumbled up the stairs, and then I saw her come back around and then go up to the stairs, and then she cradled his body.
Did she scream?
I don't think she screamed, but a few minutes after that, there was just a blood-curdling scream from someone, and it put the hair on the back of my neck straight up.
Were you relieved?
No. What happened was I was in a... What happened before the shooting, before I pulled the trigger and after, were 2 different scenes in my mind. Before, everything was like dead calm, and I was ready for this to happen. I even heard a voice, my own, inside of me say, do it, do it, do it. You know, here we go. And then afterwards, it was like the film strip broke. I fell in upon myself. I like went into a state of shock. I stood there with the gun hanging limply down on my right side, and Jose the doorman came over, and he's crying, and he's grabbing my arm, and he's shaking my arm, and he shook the gun right out of my hand, which is a very brave thing to do to an armed person. And he kicked the gun across the pavement and had somebody take it away. And I was stunned. I didn't know what to do. I took the Catcher in the Rye out of my pocket. I paced. I tried to read it. I just couldn't wait, Larry, until those police got there. I was just devastated.
It is stated on Wikipedia that Chapman read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye to address the court during his sentencing. Chapman was asked if he had anything to say, and he rose and read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye, in which Holden tells his little sister Phoebe what he wants to do with his life. I keep picturing all these little kids playing some game in this big field of rye and all. Thousands of little kids, and nobody's around, nobody big I mean, except me, and I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. What I have to do? I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. I mean, if they're running and they don't look where they're going, I have to come out of somewhere and catch them. That's all I do all day. I'd just be the catcher in the rye and all. The judge ordered psychiatric treatment for Chapman during his incarceration and sentenced him to 20 years to life, 5 years less than the maximum sentence of 25 years to life. Chapman's crime would not be the only of its kind where the book would be mentioned. John Hinckley Jr. attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan in 1981, after which police found a copy of the book in his hotel room. though there were half a dozen other books present too, and so any link between Catcher and any influence it may have had on him were dismissed. In 1989, Robert John Bardo murdered actress and model Rebecca Schaeffer after stalking her. When he visited her Hollywood apartment on the day of the murder, he was carrying a copy of The Catcher in the Rye with him. A 2012 article on the website Atomic Poet asked the question, "Is The Catcher in the Rye an assassination trigger?" A section of the article reads, "To those who do not cope with mental illness, the plot of The Catcher in the Rye seems depressing, and it is, but by the book's end, it is apparent that the events being described are actually the happiest in Holden's recent memory. What he describes is something that he remembers fondly as joyous and happy. He chooses not to mention present day, saying simply that he feels sick. Seeing his current life as inconsequential, he feels the need to start applying himself. Inside the mental hospital, he finds he misses everyone. What's striking about The Catcher in the Rye isn't how weird Caulfield is, but how normal he is. Rather than being unhinged and unpredictable, Caulfield is simply a boy very much like other boys. In this sense, it is easy for someone dealing with depression to identify with him." Caitlin Nelson wrote in 2022 on the site medium.com, "People see what they want to see when it comes to things like literature and film. If they want an angry outcast out for revenge against society to justify their actions, then they'll find one. If they want an immoral character promoting violence, that's what they'll see. Fingers have been pointed in countless places through the years, placing blame on a specific medium or genre for causing whichever issues or events have recently taken place. The Catcher in the Rye, when it was first published, was different, awkward, unapologetic and raw. Both the book and Holden himself became a problem to some, feared that they would, with their coarse and unacceptable language, do great harm. Just like those other works of art that were banned, I think the stigma surrounding Catcher in the Rye would have subsided considerably more if not for those isolated high-profile murders, in particular Mark David Chapman. Coupled with the book's rocky past, I feel Chapman had a huge part to play, perhaps even the largest, in making the mere mention of the novel a red flag to some, a portion of whom may have possibly not even read a single page of it. Like most things, I think it's all down to the individual, what they take from the book. Sure, there is dark and depression, angst and frustration in those pages. There is tiredness from people too, and their phoniness. Though, going back to the example shown earlier in this video, regarding acts of physical violence in the book, those being the altercation between Holden's roommate, and then Morris the pimp at the hotel, and the unfortunate story of James Castle, they are about as rough as the book gets. But there are also some moments when violence is just a thought, a pondering. So what of these? One instance I found in chapter 3 of the book, when Holden is speaking to a fellow student, he is wearing the red hunting hat that he just bought for himself, and when told by the other student that it's a hunting hat, used for when shooting deer, Holden replies, "Like hell it is. This is a people shooting hat. I shoot people in this hat." This, of course, is just one of Holden's quirks, something he gets a kick out of. He often has moments when he horses around and spouts falsehoods or random lines for his own amusement. They are no better or worse in his mind than saying his hat is a people shooting hat, and in context of the novel, it's clear that this is the case. Later, after being punched by Morris at the hotel, Holden imagines he has been shot in the stomach like a wounded hero, and that he staggers downstairs, confronts Morris, and ends up shooting him, 6 bullets in his fat, hairy belly. Then he accepts how ridiculous it all sounds, blaming the movies, saying, "The goddamn movies, they can ruin you." I'm not kidding. When speaking about how he hates fistfights, he says, "I'd feel I ought to sock the guy in the jaw or something, break his goddamn jaw. Only, I wouldn't have the guts to do it. I'd just stand there, trying to look tough. What I might do, I might say something very cutting and snotty to rile him up, instead of socking him in the jaw." Holden admits that he is passive when it comes to such confrontations, though feels that it does not always serve him well, musing that sometimes you have to take action, even sock someone in the jaw if it's deserved. Again, I think this plays into him being pulled in two directions: the innocence of childhood and the harsh truths and choices of adulthood. An essay on Medium.com reads, "Throughout the book, Holden oscillates between wanting to conform to society's ideal and showing glimpses of his true self, as his true nature is caring and sensitive, contradicting the manly image he sees around him and feels the need to exhibit. By the end of Holden's journey, he achieves a level of emotional maturity that allows him to break down the walls he previously built inside of himself, to reveal his true nature and begin to accept himself for his unique character. Though Holden's story appears to be out of the ordinary for typical teenagers of his time, The Catcher in the Rye is a reflection of the fact that the norms of society heavily influence the mental and emotional development of its emerging adults. In this sense, the novel serves as a touchstone for generations of alienated youth who are facing their own set of psychological challenges and journeys, influenced by their surroundings. Holden's brilliant segue from polarised domains of privileged white male into developing his insecurity over accepting his unconventional expression of masculinity serves to show how he completely and utterly triumphed in his struggle against the confines of marketplace masculinity. So, is The Catcher in the Rye really a red flag, or just misread? Being a product of its time, part of me can see how it caused the ripples that it did. At its time of publication, Catcher was new, different, with downbeat themes and sharp edges. It spoke of things that some parents wanted to shield their children from, though they were things that life itself would show or teach them regardless. The book held up a mirror to the human condition, in particular the uncomfortable and confusing transition from childhood to adulthood. It showed readers parts of themselves that perhaps they wished to forget or block out from embarrassment of their former selves, or, for those reading the books in schools, provided a source of relatability. And it's this in itself that I see as a hugely positive impact of the book, for not all words spoken about its reputation have been negative. I feel, certainly as time has gone by, that the book's reputation has clouded how people view it. As for it being misread, again I feel reputation plays a part, and also the book falling into the hands of a few individuals, one of whom took it as a personal Bible and found what motivation he sought from it to commit murder, has also had an impact on how Salinger's words are viewed. In truth, the book's ugly parts, such as those brief moments of violence, are not lingered upon. Conversation moves on from them, as should the reader. But in the case of Mark David Chapman, for example, he was someone who just couldn't. He was a loner, like Holden, and given his obsession, found a great deal of himself in those pages, though it would be he, not the book, who decided what it meant to him, how it spoke to him. He saw what he wanted to see, and fit it into his own narrative. Though he signed his copy of the novel as Holden Caulfield, it was Mark David Chapman, not Holden Caulfield, who loaded that gun and pulled the trigger.